So thank you all again for joining us. This, most of you probably won't be able to read, but we just wanted to confirm that we do have this meeting. We do have interpreters for this meeting in 3 different languages. Jasmine is available in Spanish, and we have that room set up. You probably got a queue when you came in. If you wanted to get the Spanish interpretation live, we should go through the process. We also have Julie that's translating in Mandarin, and she is also in that room. That's actually labeled Chinese. That's the only reference that Zoom gives us. And then we have Andre doing the Tagalog interpretation. And again, unfortunately, Zoom doesn't have Tagalog as a drop-down menu, so that you'll see it as Japanese, unfortunately. But he is also in that room and providing live interpretation as we go throughout the entire presentation. So if you haven't had a chance to do so, if you go down to the interpreter area at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to pick the language that you want. And that's all explained here in the languages of each of these 3 that we have available. So with that, Eric, do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. So I just wanted to give a clear direction on how we're hoping to facilitate discussion here tonight. We do have the chat option, which I believe you all are probably very familiar with. If you go to the bottom of your screen and hit the chat window, it'll pop up a screen where you can type in any comments or questions that you have throughout the meeting. We'll be keeping track of that throughout the conversation, and we'll have specific points where we're going to stop and take questions and comments after each major topic. So please do keep the questions coming as you think of them throughout, and we'll continue to track them. We're going to put them on a separate sheet and then report back to you all on what we heard at those points. When we get to those question periods as well, we're going to provide an opportunity to use the raise your hand function, and that is also at the bottom of your window, a little blue hand typically that allows you to raise your hand virtually, and I'll be able to see that and unmute your mic if you want to provide comments verbally. We encourage that as well, and during those question and comment periods, you'll have an opportunity to do that as well. Otherwise, we've generally kept the mics muted just so that we reduce any background noise, but we definitely want to hear from you all and keep this a very informal and insightful conversation. So thank you again for joining us, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mayor Garbarino to get us started.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. I'm Rich Garbarino, the Mayor of South San Francisco. And tonight we're going to introduce a general plan update. South San Francisco is in the process of updating its general plan, which will help guide how our city government makes decisions and serves residents over the next 20 to 25 years. Excuse me. The general plan covers topics we all care deeply about, including housing, the economy, parks and recreation, transportation, sustainability, social equity, and so much more. I'm pleased to kick off a series of community engagement events around land use alternatives. Our team of city staff and project consultants will share with you alternatives that test different land use and urban design patterns to understand the trade-offs between big policy questions. We will use the feedback from the community to shape the future land use map for the city and to develop the policies and implementation actions to make the change in the general plan. This is the first of 5 community workshops on land use alternatives over the next 3 weeks. I encourage you to participate in upcoming meetings and share your feedback with us. It's very important for us to hear from you to create a general plan for South San Francisco that is driven by our community values. This is a real challenging time, but we thank you for your continued interest and participation in the general plan. Thank you for being with us tonight, and we look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor. And I'm going to hand it back over to Eric now to get us started with the presentation.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Yurkovich, and I'm Associate Principal at Ramey & Associates. It's great to see so many of you back virtually. I know that a lot of you have been at the sub-area meetings and community workshops and other engagement events that have happened over the last year. I recognize your names and some of your faces, so I appreciate seeing you back. I know this is a little bit different for all of us, but we're really hoping to really start a conversation tonight and kick off this conversation about land use alternatives in South San Francisco. Our focus tonight is really to provide some context for you and understanding about those land use alternatives, to really allow you to ask some questions of us and of staff about those land use alternatives, and we can provide some more context on what they are. And then to really launch this series of meetings and online surveys where you can go and provide more input on these land use alternatives. Tonight is mostly going to be presentation and question and answer, but we have a series of sub-area meetings coming up over the next month that next 2 weeks that I'll tell you about later on, where we'll have more of that kind of informal roundtable discussion about the different sub-areas within South San Francisco. So tonight, you'll hear a lot of me presenting and stopping for polls and question and answers, and then we'll really provide that a lot of opportunity for you to give us your feedback and hear some of your questions that you have, and then we'll launch those surveys for you tonight. But before we go on, we want to know a little bit more about the folks who are in the room tonight. So we're going to launch a little online poll here that's going to pop up, and we'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself. Like to tell us about your race and ethnicity. We want to know a little bit about your age and about the neighborhood where you live in South San Francisco. This information is really to help us track and understand who's participating in the process. And for those of you who participated in earlier meetings, you'll recognize some of these questions as we've been trying to kind of keep this information and track it throughout the process. So we're going to let that poll sit up there for a minute, and then we'll close it once all of you have had a chance to weigh in and vote. Okay. So while you're voting, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the purpose of the workshop. So really here tonight, I'm here to provide kind of a brief overview of where we are in the process. We're going to review and reflect back on some of the things that we heard during the sub-area meetings, pop-up meetings, and community workshops we held over the last year. We're going to review the draft community vision, core values, and guiding principles that have been out for review over the last 6 weeks or so. And then we're going to review these land use alternatives and give you an opportunity to ask us questions about them this evening.
Eric, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll so we can get a
Great.
quick share of the results. You all should be able to get a quick synopsis of kind of who's joining us here tonight on your screen. Looks like a nice mix of folks from different neighborhoods or sub areas that are joining us, which is great. Thank you so much for taking time to take that poll. I'm going to go ahead and stop, and there'll be other opportunities here in a bit to have a little bit more discussion.
Thanks, Dave. So what is SHAPE SSF? So the SHAPE SSF is really the process to update the city's general plan, climate action plan, zoning code, and then the environmental impact report that is associated with those documents. For those of you who are less familiar, the general plan is a long-term policy document which helps guide future policymaking within the city, but also helps to direct development applications within South San Francisco. It's really an opportunity for the community to come together and create a shared vision for what the future of South San Francisco is like, and we're going to share with you tonight what that vision is. The general plan really is an opportunity for us to kind of enhance and preserve those things that are real core strengths and assets within the community while addressing new and emerging topics of concern that have happened since the last comprehensive update of the general plan, which happened in 1999. And then we're also incorporating new ideas. Some things around healthy communities, climate change, sustainability, social equity, and environmental justice. So all of those kind of things will be rolled up into this new general plan. The general plan itself doesn't stand alone. It really rests on the shoulders of the work that you as a community and as a city staff have done over the last decade. These are just a handful of the plans that we're working to incorporate into the general plan update. It's our job as a planning team to really lift up the themes, the vision, the values, the projects that are all embedded within this set of different plans and really incorporate them into the general plan update. We also know that over the last 4 months, we've been effectively living in unprecedented times. We've faced incredible economic, social, environmental, and health impacts associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've seen these incredible protests around social justice and racial justice around the death of George Floyd. This information and these events are going to help shape what is in the general plan update. Tonight, we're really focused on the land use alternatives and that discussion tonight, but we're going to have more of an opportunity to think about things like economic recovery and resilience and social equity in the general plan. We're going to make sure we lift up these current events and make sure they're incorporated into the general plan update. This diagram shows where we are in the general plan update process. Last year, we conducted a lot of discovery and learned about the city both quantitatively in terms of data analysis, but also going out and doing a series of sub-area meetings. We learned about the issues and opportunities in the community. From that information, we developed a series of vision and guiding principles. And tonight, we're going to share the work that we've been doing around the land use alternatives. From here, we'll develop a final land use plan and start to develop the policy frameworks that help to implement that land use plan, and then draft the general plan, the zoning code, and the EIR as part of the next phases of the process. As I mentioned, we've done a significant amount of engagement to date, of which many of you have participated in. This is just a listing of those events. These really focused initially on really understanding what some of those core values were of residents within the city, really learning what the assets were and what you wanted to save and preserve, what was really special about South San Francisco. We learned about what some of the opportunities and issues were that you saw in the community. And what we've done is we've taken that information and really rolled that up into the vision and guiding principles. And then we're starting to now to pivot, and in the spring, we started to talk about where people would like to see things like new housing and new parks. And that gets to this idea of land use alternatives, which we're going to be talking about today as well. This is just a series of images to give you a little bit of the flavor of some of those community meetings and workshops that happened back in the in-person times, which now seems so long ago. But this gives you a sense of the flavor of what some of those workshops look like. So the vision and guiding principles. The vision is really the statement of where South San Francisco wants to be in the future. And this is the draft vision that we've had up and circulating over the last month for community comment. So I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud for folks who are on the phone. South San Francisco is a place where everyone can thrive. Its high quality of life, diverse and inclusive community, livable neighborhoods, and excellent services, culture of innovation, and environmental leadership ensure all people have equitable opportunities to reach their full potential. So that vision statement is sort of an umbrella over the entire general plan and what we're trying to achieve through the implementation of the general plan update. That general plan encompasses these 4 community values. So during all of our engagement activities, we really heard people feel very strongly about these particular values, that the city should be innovative, it should be sustainable, it should be equitable and inclusive, and it should be livable for all of its residents. These are sort of the value statements that tell us how we're going to implement the general plan over time. And they'll be kind of cross-cutting across all parts of the general plan update. These are also, this diagram also shows the guiding principles within the general plan update. There are 6 of them here. These are around safe, affordable, and amenity-rich neighborhoods, high quality and accessible services, safe, convenient transportation networks, a resilient community, a vibrant downtown, and a prosperous economy. These are the kind of the what we want to do in the general plan. And these 2 are kind of these cross-cutting principles that we're trying to implement through the general plan policies around land use, housing, economic development, safety. All of those things help bring to bear these guiding principles. Now we're going to stop for a minute and we're going to ask if you have any questions for us on any of the process to date, where we are on the vision and guiding principles, And I'm going to kind of unshare my screen now so we can kind of all see each other. If you want to chat us questions in the chat function, that's terrific. If you'd like to raise your hand and ask us a question orally, you may do that.
你要是有问题可以问我们，不要跟我们讲话，也可以把那个电，我们可以看到你。所以我们可以看见。
Julie,
Yes.
Julie, I think you're in the wrong room. You need to get back into the Chinese Mandarin room. Sorry about that, everyone.
Sorry.
Eric, I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll real quick about the vision statement so that folks could
just be able
to see that now. So if this was just a question, you heard the statement. We just wanted to get a general sense from you all if you agree with the statement, strongly disagree, or anywhere in between, and that could help kind of spur our conversation here as well. And then as Eric mentioned, definitely feel free to do the chat window, and or you can raise your hand. Julie, I'm sorry, you're back in the wrong room. I think you need to just go to the interpreters and pick the Mandarin.
Okay, let me see. Okay, there we go.
The Chinese, thank you.
Got it. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, we're going to give this maybe another couple seconds here. Looks like we got almost 30 folks that have taken the poll. I'm going to go ahead and end it so we can see.
Julie, you're
back on.
I put it on the interpreter thing.
You need to pick the Chinese.
Let me see. I went in the interpretation. I put Chinese.
Yeah.
I'm in there. I put done, and then it's supposed to be in Chinese. Hello?
Yeah.
Am I in Chinese?
No, you're not, Julie. Maybe you need to just get off and get back on, maybe.
Okay. I'll do that. All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay. I don't know if you all are able to see the results, but it looks like more than half of the folks strongly agree with the statement, or at least agree with it. 75% either agreed or strongly agreed, which is excellent. There were a few that strongly disagreed, and I'm curious, of those that strongly disagreed, if you'd like to use the raise your hand function or the chat window to let us know why you might have disagreed, not to put you on the spot. Or others that would like to provide additional input, definitely feel free. And if there isn't any, we can definitely continue to move forward with the rest of the presentation. There'll be other opportunities to let us know your thoughts. I don't see anything popping up. So,
Dave, this is Billy. I'm just getting a message that Julie in the interpreters one can't unmute herself. So just if you have that ability.
Sure. Yep.
Sorry.
No problem. I'm going to make sure she's unmuted.
There it goes. I got in, Billy. Thank you so much. I'm out. Thank you, Billy. Appreciate it. Now I am
right,
talking.
Julie, I'm gonna go ahead and put you back in that room now, so you should have that option popping up on your screen. Sorry about that all. Okay. Christy said sorry. Okay, no problem. She didn't want to vote. Some people wanted to kind of see the results as they came through, which is great. And actually, just so you all know, I never actually unmuted anyone, so you should be able to unmute yourselves pretty freely at this point. We didn't use that option unless one of the other co-hosts did, so feel free to chime in. I think we're going to go ahead and move forward from here. I don't see any other major comments coming in, and again, there'll be plenty of opportunity to speak through it. So I'll make sure you all can unmute, and I'm going to give it back over to you, Eric, to take us to the next step of the presentation.
Okay, thanks. I have to close down all these windows. So hold on a second. All right, so one of the things that we want to do tonight is just provide everyone with some background information so that when we talk about the land use alternatives, everyone's kind of on the same page with the same level of understanding. So the first thing I'm going to do is just talk a little bit generally about what land use is. It really is the kind of the human activities that take place on the land. There are literally dozens of different activities and land uses that happen across the city of South San Francisco. We take all that information and all those activities, and we start to kind of organize it by the different types. So there are residential uses, there are commercial uses, there are public and institutional uses. This slide really just kind of illustrates some of the range of those different kinds of land uses that exist already within South San Francisco. So on your left-hand side, you see different residential uses from single-family homes down to multifamily housing. On the second column, you see retail, service uses, and hospitality uses. And sometimes we have mixed uses, which we either show as a hatch or a purple color. And those mixed uses really mean that on a particular site, there might be a mixture of housing with retail or retail with office use, all kind of mixed up in the same building or on the same parcel. In addition to kind of those retail and service types of uses, there are things like office, R&D, which is research and development. And a lot of the life sciences buildings east of 101 are sort of in that office and research and development category. And there's a lot of industrial uses. So trucking, warehousing, and logistics are big uses within South San Francisco. And then you also kind of have these different kinds of public and institutional uses. Some of them, like City Hall, are publicly owned, or Orange Park, those are publicly owned sites. And some of them are owned by other outside organizations like All Souls Church. We take all that information about those uses and that organization, and then we kind of lay them out on the map of South San Francisco. And so this map really shows the land use distribution across the city of South San Francisco. So these, the colors on this map relate to the pictures that you saw on the previous one. So the yellow is single family homes, the darker brown is multifamily residential, the red is retail use, the light brown is that office and research and development use, and the gray, that light gray, is that industrial and those industrial uses across the city. And the district, when we sum all that area up, about a third of the city is devoted to single family homes, and just under half of the city is devoted to residential uses overall. The other really big uses in the city are office and R&D and industrial uses. And those two categories combined are about a third of the land area in the city, and about a fifth of the land area in the city is devoted to industrial uses, which makes sense. It's an industrial city, so there's a big base of industrial uses. And then about a fifth of the land area is devoted to those public and institutional uses or parks and open space, so those blues and greens on the map. So the city uses a variety of tools to kind of regulate how land use is developed in the city. It's the general plan, specific plans, and zoning are kind of the three primary methods that they use. And tonight we're here really to talk about the general plan. Later on in the process, we're going to be talking very specifically about the zoning. So what are general plan land uses? These really are this is the map that illustrates the land use policy vision for the future of South San Francisco. It's required by state law to talk about the distribution, location, and extent of land uses across the city and the intensity of those land uses across the city. And so every city and county in California is required by the state to have this map with that information associated with it. And now it's important to recognize that the general plan map is not existing land use. It's the policy vision for the future. So it's not necessarily what's on the ground now, it's what we want to happen in the future. And while we talk about alternatives today, we're talking about what we want to happen in the future. We're talking about testing those different ideas. This general plan land use vision is really implemented through the zoning code. So this is the real teeth of how things get built on the ground within the city. So the zoning code has the development standards and guidelines that every project application has to abide by. This includes things like very, very detailed lists of land uses, the density, the height, the setback of a building from the street or a sidewalk or their neighboring property, or the requirements for open space and parking on a particular site, and the transition between a building on one parcel and the next parcels adjacent to it. So all of that very detailed information is included in the zoning code and not necessarily in the general plan. So that's kind of an overview on the land use. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what the land use alternatives are now. So the land use alternatives are, the purpose of them is really to test these different land use and urban design ideas or policy questions. We want to really understand the trade-offs between making different policy choices within the city. So those could be things like, how do we maintain South San Francisco as an economic engine for the region? Do we prioritize industrial uses? Do we prioritize office and R&D uses and life sciences? Where do we place housing and at what intensity? So the land use alternatives at a high level test those policy trade-offs between different land use patterns in the city so that we can make informed choices about the future. These land use alternatives that we're going to show in a few minutes really look at three specific things. One is the kind of the pattern of land use and the large scale distribution of where residential is versus where commercial is across the city. The second is the mix of land uses. So we zoom in a little bit and think about in an individual small area, in a neighborhood or in a center, what's the mix of uses is there? What's residential? What's commercial? What's park and open space? And the third thing we're starting to look at is the relative intensity of those different land uses. So what's lower density and what's higher density? And so where do you stick those different uses across the city? And then we evaluate those different land use alternatives. We think a little bit about the balance of jobs and housing, how people travel in the future, and the greenhouse gas emissions so that we can sort of start to compare these different alternatives to one another. These alternatives are really built out of what we call place types, or these are the building blocks. So these are the land uses that are on the ground. You're going to see colorful maps that have different land uses or place types on them. So some of these, like residential medium density, business and technology park, and mixed use low, are all things that already happen within South San Francisco. And what we're doing is lifting up some of those types. In other cases, we're testing new ideas, like what would a higher density mixed industrial area look like in the city? How would that behave and accommodate new growth in the city? So we're testing both things that are there already and new ideas for the future. And underlying all of these different place types and these different alternatives are really how we create great places. So where do we gather? Where do we walk to shops? How do we create safe streets that we can easily get around in? How do we create a variety of housing choices that accommodate a variety of ages, household types, and demographic categories across the city? And then how do those play out both at the neighborhood or the sub-area scale, and how do those knit together as a city as a whole? So when we think about the alternatives, we're sort of trying to mix all of these ingredients together to create a series of great places and a great city. Right now, we're in the process of where we're exploring these different land use alternatives. That's what we're doing tonight, and that's what we'll be doing over the next several weeks. Once we get community input on these alternatives and we talk to Planning Commission and City Council about the alternatives, we'll kind of create a preferred land use alternative. It could be one of the alternatives we present tonight, a mix and match of several of the alternatives, or something totally new that we haven't thought of already. And that will become the preferred land use plan, and that will become the general plan land use map. And once that land use map is set, then we'll go into kind of more detailed analysis on the specific zoning requirements that are associated with each parcel of land in South San Francisco. So we're going to go through this process in a stepwise manner, and we're going to come back to you at each step to get more engagement and more feedback on the plan. So now I'm going to give just a little bit of background about how we create the alternatives. The first thing we have to do is establish a common baseline across the city. So this is the same existing land use map you saw on the previous diagram. We spent a lot of time working to figure out what was on the ground already in the city. And then we take things like the number of housing units, the number of jobs in the city, and we kind of establish that baseline within the city so that we can measure change over time. And then in particular, we recognize that these numbers are from 2018 and they do not reflect what's happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we will not know for quite some time what the actual impacts are on the ground in the city. We have anecdotal data, but none of that is the true data. So as a planning process, we kind of establish that baseline so that we can measure into the future. We also think about other environmental considerations. So we're near SFO, so there's height restrictions. We're looking at the implications for sea level rise on the pattern of future use and how we can mitigate sea level rise in the future. And then we've also, as a team, compiled a market analysis to really understand what the direction has been in the past in terms of the economy in the city, and then where it might be headed into the future. So we know that biotechnology and life sciences have been a real strong and primary driver of development activity within the city, and that's anticipated to continue into the future. We also know that while the production, distribution, and repair has declined in the city over the last 10 years or so, it's still about a quarter of the jobs that are within the city are in these kind of industrial uses and are likely to kind of maintain moving into the future. And that we also know that the retail environment has changed significantly over the last decade and will continue to change into the future. But we know that as we expand and add more housing and more jobs in the city, that we can expect to see more viable retail in the future. I want to just pause a minute. I think it's important to just reflect on the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic on kind of the local economy. You know, it's caused unprecedented unemployment, up to 14%. I think I saw in the region. We've seen diminished demand for things like retail and hospitality uses, and there's been severely compromised fiscal health for cities all over the country and all over the world. And in some ways, South San Francisco has benefited from having a diverse economy that has a lot of uses, which has maintained some of that fiscal health within this pandemic. And we also know that the city will have those competitive assets during economic recovery. So it's something for the city to continue to build on. So as we think about the 2040 land use plan and what happens in 2040, we want to think about how we get there and the steps we're doing now to aid economic recovery. There's a lot of things we just don't know and won't know for a long time. We don't know how long the economic recession is going to last or what the full market implications are going to be, and we won't for some time. And then a lot of things have changed. Our social behavior, how we work, how we travel have changed significantly over the last 4 months. And we don't know what that's going to look like in the future and whether those behaviors will stay the same or whether they'll go back to normal once a vaccine is found for COVID-19. One of the key things that we're looking at as part of this general plan update is housing. And the city has permitted about 1,000 residential units, 977 units between 2015 and currently at the end of last year, over the last, about the last 5 years. We also know that there's a continued strong demand for housing both within the city, but within the larger Bay Area and California region as a whole. And we know that there's a number of housing projects that are already in the pipeline in South San Francisco, which would produce several thousand additional housing units. Now, the state and regional governments ask each city every 8 years to update their housing element. And during that housing element, the cities have to find and accommodate space for additional housing units. In the last cycle of the housing element update, from 2015 to 2023, the city was required to find space for about 1,864 housing units. Now, the process is to update what's called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment is happening now. And it's looking like that cities are going to be asked to accommodate 2 to 4 times that allocation of housing within the next 8-year cycle. So from 2022 to 2030, the city of South San Francisco could be asked to accommodate some 3,700 to 7,400 housing units. So these are numbers we're looking at to help us plan for that short 8-year period. But the general plan is really looking out over 2 to 3 regional housing needs assessment cycles and housing element cycles. So we're really looking at this range of something like 11,000 to 22,000 housing units over this period about to like 2045. So as we're starting to look at these land use alternatives, we're really testing these different ideas of where we could, how much of this housing could we accommodate, where could we accommodate it at these different levels, and we'll talk about that in a minute. In addition to that kind of technical background that we did a series of community surveys back in the spring, and we asked people where they'd like to see new housing and where they'd like to see new parks and new jobs. And so we took that information along with that technical information and started to develop these land use alternatives for the city. So now we'll actually kind of get into those land use alternatives, and I'll kind of break down and go through each of them. But first, it's important to recognize where we are now and what the current policy is for the city. So the land use alternatives are really testing ideas that are different than the city's current general plan. And as we look at the alternatives, you'll always have an opportunity to go back to the current general plan and say, that's what I prefer and I like this option as well. So as I mentioned earlier, this plan was adopted comprehensively in 1999 and then amended as recently as 2015 in a significant way to incorporate the downtown station area specific plan. This general plan really looks at accommodating new housing in the downtown area and then along the El Camino corridor primarily. And then it looks to keep Lindenville and the east of 101 as really these primary economic engines for the city with their different types of employment uses in different areas. This general plan would be expected to increase jobs significantly across the city if it was continued to be implemented over time, and it would add some housing units to the city's overall stock. But overall, the jobs housing balance would get worse with the implementation of the current general plan and the policy direction that's shown in these the land use designations. The land use alternatives that we're going to show tonight are really kind of lift up these 7 big ideas. And we're going to launch a poll in just a second to get your sense of what you think is the most important of these big ideas. So first, we want to make sure that in any of the options, we want to make sure that the city maintains itself as an economic engine for the region. It's the industrial city, and we want to make sure that it is a job center, not just here within the city, but within the larger sub-region in the entire Bay Area. And the questions we're going to be looking at are things like, what's the balance of office and research and development versus the balance of industrial uses? The second thing we're really testing is how do we produce both workforce and affordable housing for both current residents who are here in the city and then maybe future residents who want to live in the city. The third thing reflects this desire to reinforce downtown as the heart of South San Francisco. And this really lifts up themes that were in the last general plan and also in the downtown stationary specific plan, of really making Grand Avenue the heart of South San Francisco. The fourth idea is really to test developing a kind of a mixed-use transit-oriented community near the Caltrain station that's connected to downtown, that supports the downtown, and that prioritizes active mobility of transportation. And then across the city, we're really looking about improving multimodal mobility. So that's things like, how do we walk places? How are we able to walk places or bike places safely and easily? How are we able to take transit to meet our daily needs? Next, we also look at addressing sea level rise. And across all of the alternatives, we've been thinking a little bit about how we can use land use change to help leverage improvements in investments in adapting to sea level rise, both in the east of 101 area and then also in Lindenville. And then finally, we wanted to lift up this idea of transforming Coma Creek. This is something that has been in discussion for many, many years that far exceeds our work in South San Francisco, but was really lifted up by the Resilient by Design work and then the adaptation along Coma Creek. So how can we really make Coma Creek amenity and corridor throughout the city? So with that, I think we're going to launch a little poll to get a sense from you what you think are your top big ideas. And I believe you can vote for 2.
Thanks, Eric. And we've been having a lot of great questions coming in related to the alternatives. So maybe we'll go through this big ideas poll here real quick and get a sense of how where you all feel, I guess, your big idea falls, or what you think should be highlighted most within the general plan based on these big ideas. And then Eric, maybe we could address a couple of questions that have come up before we move on to the next section, if that sounds good.
Great. That's fine.
Cool. And just for you all to know, I did unmute you all, and then we had a slight issue, which I was concerned about, where there was a lot of background noise. So I had to go through and mute a few of you that were accidentally unmuted. So if you have an issue of being unmuted, I think the best approach is just to go ahead and do the raise your hand function, and we'll go ahead and get you unmuted. It looks like we have about 50 folks that have taken the poll. I'm going to go ahead and end it and share the results. And you should all be able to see it now. Looks like produce, workforce, and affordable housing had the most votes, followed by maintain South San Francisco as an economic engine for the region and reinforce downtown as the heart of the community. But good to see that everything got a vote, which tells us that we are generally on the right track, and this is consistent with all the great input that we received to date. So we appreciate that. Eric, I don't know if there's any other thoughts you want to share there before we answer maybe a couple questions that came through the chat.
No, I think it's just really interesting to see again that there's, even across these ideas, that there's a distribution of what people think are the priorities across them. There's no one right answer to this question, but they bring up the different values from each of these different ideas. So there are a couple questions in the chat that I'll read out and try and answer pretty quickly, I think. The first one is about why is the California golf course labeled as, yes, Dave?
Go ahead, sorry. We had a couple answers to questions that we've been answering as we go, but you're doing the right one. Go ahead, keep moving forward. Sorry.
Yeah, cool, thanks. So the question was, why is the California golf course labeled as parks, common areas? Isn't it a private club? Well, that's a great question, and it's true, and it's actually not incorporated within South San Francisco. What we've tried to do in the map is just to sort of simplify all the land use colors so that it's easy to read on a screen. In reality, when you look at a zoning map, which is the more detailed version, you'll see a lot more detail and a lot more difference in the different types of those uses. Catherine asked, is the city planning to rezone single-family residential zones to multifamily zones? If yes, what is the process for the city goes through? Does the city have to get neighborhood approval to do that, or voter approval? One of the things that we've tried to do in the land use, and I think this is a really important question, and I appreciate Catherine bringing this up. One of the things that we've tried to do is to think about how we accommodate the land use change that we're showing in these alternatives within very specific areas of the city. So along its transit-oriented mixed-use corridors, around those transit stations like Caltrain, so that we don't touch all of those single-family neighborhoods, and we're not upzoning those single-family neighborhoods. Many of you are all probably familiar with SB 50, if I remember. It was Scott Wiener's bill to increase, to upzone single-family neighborhoods along transit corridors. That's not something that we're really talking about as part of this general plan update. So there is not really a process necessarily to go through to do that, to answer Catherine's question, because that's not something that we're really talking about, and that's on the table.
Eric, do you want me to read the next one? Popped up?
Yeah, great. That would help. Yeah, sorry, thanks.
So it's, is the city planning to rezone single-family residential? Did you just go through that one? You did. Yes. You did. Okay. The next question was, I know we want to welcome more industry companies like biotech. However, given that Genentech's tax money is held in limbo due to 600 plus tax appeals from early as 2000, how are we as a city going to address this issue?
That is a question, Kelly, that I don't know the answer to, but that is something that we could look into getting a response to from city staff.
Great.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? And I don't see any raised hands either.
We do have one that actually just popped up by Raymond. Raymond, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute yourself if you would like to.
Yeah, hey.
There you go.
Quick question for you. I thought you were going to touch on it earlier, but I didn't hear. So I had heard that some of the cities in and around the Bay Area have been questioning the regional housing needs assessment, at least the allocations therein, just because of everything that's been happening with COVID and the shifts in terms of, you know, are people going to be in the Bay Area or where are they going to be? Those types of questions. Is that a factor or consideration for what we are planning as part of this general plan?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, Raymond. We don't know the answer to where the regional housing needs assessment is going to fall at this point. What we know is that the state has given the Bay Area a significantly higher allocation of housing this go around than it did in the previous go around. I know that process is underway and they're developing the methodologies, and then we'll work with individual jurisdictions over the next year to develop those projections, which I'm sure will be heavily influenced by the pandemic once we have a better sense of the actual impacts on the ground to households and to occupancy and vacancy of housing within the cities, as well as what its impact has been on the economy. I know from my experience working in Southern California, which is 2 years ahead of the Bay Area, that the state and the region are plowing ahead, and that the statutory requirements haven't really changed for those jurisdictions in Southern California, at least as of yet. Now, I'm sure their conversations are ongoing, but the expectation is still that they'll find sites for all the housing, and that it will be similar to what was the pre-COVID projections for all of those jurisdictions in Southern California. It's a very good question. Right.
Great. And Eric, it looked like Kelly had a follow-up, which I think we probably have to come back to her on, but was since the golf course is incorporated with parks and common areas, is our city's tax money going to that? That was a follow-up to the earlier question, and maybe we can come back to that or have city staff follow up on that as well.
Yep, that would be terrific. Thanks, Dave.
Great. Okay, I don't see any other raised hands or any other questions coming through. Thank you so much for everyone contributing. And I wanted to just reference, we haven't brought it up yet, but we're using this really fun virtual whiteboard tool. We're taking down all these comments. We'll share it with you live here towards the end so you can kind of see all this coming together. But just wanted to make sure that as we're getting these comments coming through, it's all being recorded by the team so that we make sure that we take this forward with us. So with that, hand it back over to you, Eric, to take us to the next section.
All right, thanks, Dave. And thanks for all the great comments and chat questions. We appreciate them. And now we're actually going to get into the kind of the heart and the meat of the discussion. So just a simple way to kind of help conceptualize how we take those big ideas that are on the paper, that are in that Venn diagram on the previous slide, and institutionalize them, so to speak, in the city. So really we want to kind of focus on this core, that's the downtown area, right? So this is kind of the heart of the community that we've heard so much about and that people love and kind of want to build up and reinforce over time. So then we think about, in addition to that kind of center of activity, where are all of the other kinds of centers of activity that happen within the city? So these are big areas, these are small little mixed-use neighborhood centers, and there are larger ones like this transit-oriented community next to the Caltrain station. So what you can see here is that these are kind of these little centers of pockets of activity that happen across the city. And there's more of them across the city, but this is just kind of give you that sense and that big idea. So you have the downtown, a kind of a bigger mixed-use center near Caltrain, this kind of these mixed-use nodes or mixed-use centers along El Camino, these three of them, at the BART station, near the Civic Center area, and at the Spruce Avenue and El Camino intersection. And then you have all these other ones in Westboro and then also Winston-Salem. And then we think about how to connect all these up with different multimodal corridors. So how do you get from one center of activity to another? By walking, by biking, by transit use. So we start to think about what is the multimodal transportation to get us between these different centers of activity, and then how do you get down from all of the residential neighborhoods and commercial areas that surround these these centers of activities. And then the last thing is, like, how do we transform Coma Creek? What does that corridor look like in the city? How can it be a part of not just a solution for moving water in the city, which is what it is now, but how can it be part of nature? How can we use it for access as a multimodal corridor and as a place to recreate and congregate? So sort of thinking about how you operationalize those ideas that were on that previous slide. One of the concepts you're going to hear me say a lot, and you just saw on the last slide, and is this idea of a transit-oriented community. Now, I'm going to guess a lot of you have heard of the concept of transit-oriented development, which is really about putting new housing and new jobs as densely as possible near those transit stations. I think what we're talking about tonight incorporates some of those ideas, but thinks about it a little bit more holistically. So we want to focus not just on the density at the station and the land use at the station, which is a component of a transit-oriented community, but we want to focus really on how do we improve mobility around the station? How can we better walk, bike, roll to the station, around the station, in the neighborhoods that are surrounding those areas? These concepts really help foster and support ideas of sustainable development and equitable development within the community when we look at producing housing affordable to a range of different income levels. And so it's not just this idea of massing a bunch of density right at the transit station, but how do we create a nice gradation of density that's really connected to the larger neighborhoods and region and really promotes these ideas of sustainability and equity. With the Coma Creek transformation, many of you have been a part of conversations about that in the past. Many of you were probably part of the Resilient by Design effort in South San Francisco, and some of you maybe have been part of this Coma Creek adaptation planning process. But it really rests on three key principles that I just want to lift up. So when we say transform Coma Creek, you're kind of understanding what we're sort of talking about. So the first is really to manage water, to let it flow. So how do we manage the water that's in there now? And then what would happen in a changing climate with additional water within the basin? So the second is not just to manage water, but how do we encourage nature and biodiversity to really get pulled into the corridor? So we recreate this as a creek and not just a channel. And the third principle is really about people and access to the creek. So how can this be a spot for recreation, for gathering, and then for moving both along the corridor and to the corridor? How can it be a place for multimodal transportation? So when I say transform Coma Creek, these are the ideas that we're thinking about in that transformation. Now on the maps I'm about to show you, you're going to see a lot of these different colors on the maps, and those are what we call the place types, or those building blocks, which I brought up earlier. I wanted to show you a few examples of what those looked like for types that you maybe were less familiar with, or maybe ones and some that you are familiar with. So this is a type that you'll see on the land use alternative maps. It's called the urban mixed use or the transit core. This is really only in one place. It's right next to the Caltrain station and adjacent to that. And it's really kind of a high density mix of uses with generous public spaces and nice streets for pedestrians and cyclists. And this really gets at that idea of those transit-oriented communities. The second type you'll see on a map that you maybe are a little less familiar with is kind of medium density mixed use. Now, this is a kind of a type that you'll often see allowed along the El Camino corridor. An example, you might see it at the South San Francisco BART station, or even along Linden Avenue in the downtown area. And this is kind of what some of that might look like. And so you have retail on the ground floor of these buildings, and maybe residential or some other upper floor use above it. This is an example of low density mixed use, which you also see as a purple use on the maps. This is really focused on retail, services, but really focused on the neighborhood, kind of what you do to support local neighborhoods. And these buildings might have just some retail and services, or in some cases, they might have some residential or office uses on top of those uses. And this is something you might find when we show you the Westboro alternative and Westboro. Business and technology park is something that we reference regularly. It's a type that it occurs in the city. All of it is east of 101 primarily. And these are just some examples of what that looks like. And then there's another type that I mentioned earlier, but that you'll see on the maps, which is a mixed industrial high. So the city of South San Francisco has a lot of kind of one-story, single-story warehouse and industrial buildings. This idea and this type really shows something that's a 2 or 3 or 4-story industrial building that accommodates a greater diversity of uses within it that are now more common in areas where spaces become more and more constrained for industrial spaces. So you'll see that on the maps as well. And then there's a series of residential uses that you'll see on the maps. These range from higher intensity residential uses to lower intensity residences. And these are just some examples of what that might look like in South San Francisco. So this is a map that shows alternative 1. This alternative really kind of lightly updates the city's current general plan in a lot of ways. And it really kind of maintains the city as an economic engine, adding a lot of jobs over time and adding a substantial amount of housing. But in this scenario, you see that the jobs and housing balance overall get worse. So I'm going to go through the 4 kind of primary change areas that you see on each of the maps. The first is in downtown, where the changes in the land uses are. And as I think maybe it was Catherine who pointed out, so are we rezoning residential areas? We're not really looking at that as an option. So we're really focused on these kind of 4 areas. That's downtown, east of 101, Lindenville, and then the El Camino corridor. So we're really focusing on land use change, and we're going to highlight some of those changes on each of these maps. So these are kind of some descriptions of what's happening in the downtown area. It really maintains Grand Avenue as that mixed-use core, and it allows mixed use to come down from downtown south to Colma Creek. So it allows lower and middle intensity mixed use down to Colma Creek. It also allows a little bit of additional mixed use running north along Airport Boulevard to really create a nice gateway into downtown from sister cities. The second area that I wanted to highlight is the east of 101 area. And this really shows kind of this transit-oriented community, really focused right around, you can see that Caltrain station, that Caltrain C right there. This alternative tests this other idea. So we talked about maintaining South San Francisco as an economic engine for the region. This one allows the biotechnology and life sciences and office uses to kind of move further south of East Grand Avenue into the Utah and Harbor Way area to allow that type of use there, which is currently an industrial, mixed industrial area. This alternative, though, while it allows that office and R&D use to come south in east of 101, it sort of maintains Lindenville as that core area of industrial. So it keeps that heart of mixed industrial here in the Lindenville area and south. And then each of the alternatives kind of for the El Camino area really creates these sort of 3 little mixed use nodes along the corridor. One at the BART station, one at the Chestnut area where the Civic Center is, and then one south at Spruce Avenue. And then in between that, there's a kind of a mixed use corridor pattern that runs along the corridor. In this alternative, we've really kind of maintained the heights and densities that are allowed in the El Camino corridor. And then there's a couple of small changes outside of these kind of primary change areas. I'm going to highlight a couple of those as we go through. And this shows that we've said that instead of just commercial that's allowed at the Westboro Shopping Center, that we could have a mix of uses in that area. So it could have retail with some residential and some senior housing or something similar over top of it. This is what some of those different place types would look like in different areas. So we pulled forward some of those images so you could visualize what these colors on the map might look like for each of these different areas. The second alternative maintains that kind of the city as that jobs engine for the city, but changes the mix of different types of non-residential uses, which I'll talk about in a second, but adds a significant amount of additional housing. And you can see in this alternative, you get about the jobs housing balance stays about the same within the city in this alternative. In the downtown area, we maintain Grand Avenue as that kind of mixed use core. We allow that mixed use to kind of come down to Colma Creek like we did in alternative 1. And we sort of allow that gateway north along North Airport Boulevard up to Sister Cities. So you have that mixed use corridor there. And in this alternative, we also test this idea of putting kind of a small mixed use center at the Linden and Airport area. So that darker purple area. So there could be kind of a concentration of retail uses and gathering spaces with housing in that particular area. East of 101, we've really looked at kind of expanding that transit-oriented community around the Caltrain station. This expands both north along the 101 corridor, a little bit to the east in the area, and then south along North Airport Boulevard to kind of create a mixed-use corridor that connects up to the Caltrain station. In this alternative, we did allow the office and the office and the R&D and the bio business technology park to move south into kind of the industrial area. We've kind of maintained that core area of mixed industrial, but because we sort of haven't allowed that expansion of uses, that change, we've allowed both of them to increase in density. So this allows increase in kind of that office R&D type use over time, and then also the expansion and improvement of those industrial sites. And I think one of the key things that we've been thinking about is how do we address sea level rise in these alternatives? And can we leverage improvement of properties in this area, in the kind of the Utah area in the south, to help facilitate improvements in sea level rise protection in the area? In this area, this is Lindenville. In this alternative, we've allowed the mixed use to come south of Colma Creek in this alternative down to Victory Avenue. This allows us to kind of leverage those improvements around the creek to kind of create really nice spaces for people and housing around the creek, and to allow additional residential along the 101 corridor in that darker purple. This alternative also allows the expansion of office and R&D uses within the Lindenville area up to Victory Avenue, so they sort of come together in that area. And what this does is it kind of squeezes out some of that industrial and kind of focuses it in the southern portion of Lindenville and then in the east of 101 area. And then along the El Camino corridor, we've sort of maintained that same pattern of those 3 little centers along the corridor, which is consistent with all the plans that have been done. But in this alternative, what we've done is kind of reduced the intensity of that use. So we heard a lot during those community conversations back in the fall and spring about the desire to make sure that the uses along El Camino and heights were more compatible with the residential neighborhoods around them. And so we've done that, and we've illustrated that in this alternative. And then finally, we tested a couple other ideas that came up, which is there are 2 former school sites that are vacant or they're no longer used by the school district, the Sierra Vista site, excuse me, and the Fox Hills site. And so we've allowed those to house residential uses if they transition over time. This is what that alternative looks like with some pictures, and you can get a visualization for what some of these land uses look like in different areas across the city. Alternative 3, this alternative really bumps up the housing significantly compared to the other alternatives. And what it does is it not only maintains the city as an economic engine, but it actually improves the city's overall jobs to housing ratio by devoting more of the area to allow residential uses in that area. So in the downtown area, again, it kind of maintains Grand as that mixed use center, maintains that transit-oriented community near the Caltrain station, allows medium density mixed use to happen along the Linden corridor with a neighborhood center in the north along North Airport Boulevard. And then this alternative, it also allows higher intensity mixed use to come south towards Coma Creek. This alternative east of 101, again, really expands that kind of the center, this mixed use center east of 101, and it allows it to intensify so that higher density residential could be in those areas, and those, you can see those with those deeper purples. And like alternative 2, this sort of maintains the kind of the current area of the business technology park and then mixed industrial, but allows both of them to improve over time and allow higher intensity uses on both of those sites. And then in this alternative, we're really testing in Lindenville, we allow much higher density mixed use to come into Lindenville to accommodate more residential uses down to Victory. That's kind of the higher density mixed use. But in this one, we really maintain that core industrial area in Lindenville and allow it to also intensify so those properties can improve over time. And like alternative 2, we've really kind of maintained that those 3 little mixed-use centers that happen along the El Camino corridor, and then connecting them with a mixed-use corridor in between, while also kind of lowering those heights, particularly in that Chestnut area where there's higher intensities allowed. And this alternative also illustrates having housing on both of those former school sites as well. So this is what that alternative looks like in images, so you can kind of get a sense of what it might look and feel like in the different areas of the city. Now, I have 2 more slides and then I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to get your questions. As part of this, we wanted to just test, well, how much population or how many jobs or how many housing units could any of these alternatives accommodate under kind of a reasonable set of growth scenarios. And so this is that kind of illustration that shows both existing condition, your current general plan, and then each of these 3 alternatives lined up. At the bottom half of the table, you can see some metrics that we've been looking at to kind of think about how we can start to understand and evaluate these different alternatives and their particular impacts. So we've been thinking a lot about the jobs per housing unit. So what is the jobs housing balance with each of these different alternatives? And you can see that over time, they would improve with each of the alternatives 1, 2, and 3 as you add more housing. We also wanted to, this is the industrial city, so we also want to understand the implications for industrial space in the city. So we've done some estimates of how this would affect the supply of industrial space in the city. You can see in alternatives 1 or 2, that supply drops, but in alternative 3, it picks back up again because we've kind of allowed more of that space and allowed that densification. We're also looking at how trip behavior and travel behavior changes over time. So we can see with each of the alternatives, there's a steady increase in the share of travel that's done by walking, biking, or transit use. And then finally, we tested to understand the sustainability implications of each of these without doing any new policy measures in the city to understand their effects on greenhouse gas emissions per capita. And you can kind of see that they're all sort of the same from the current general plan to each of the alternatives without additional policy interventions to implement. So I'm going to stop here and just share this last slide with you that you can see kind of each of these, the current general plan and then the 3 alternatives side by side, and you can kind of see these slider bars of housing units, number of jobs, and then the kind of the jobs housing balance implications for each. So with that, I'm gonna pause. We are gonna launch a poll to get your kind of just your gut reaction about each of these land use alternatives, and to hear specifically how important is it to you to balance future jobs and housing within South San Francisco. So I'm going to pause there, leave this up for a second. I know we got a number of comments and questions in the chat during the presentation, so we're going to start going through those. If you have comments or questions, please raise your hand, and we're going to have you share those with us as well.
Thank you, Eric. This gives you a chance to take a quick breath. Thank you for that. That was great. And as Eric mentioned, we have been tracking all of your great comments and questions. And after we go through this poll, what I'm going to ask Eric to do is stop sharing his screen, and I'm going to give you a quick glimpse once we've gone through some of the questions of how this is kind of coming together and how we're tabulating these results. And we're going to be doing a lot more of this as we get into the sub-area meetings as well and get into small group discussions. So it'd be interesting for you all to be able to see that. I'm going to leave the poll open here just for another couple seconds, and then we can close that and maybe take a quick look at that, and that could help us kind of spur the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and end it now. Looks like we got almost 40 participants, which is great. Okay, ending now, sharing results. Eric, you want to take folks through these results real quick while we tabulate the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone can see it, I think, now. You can see that over half of the participants who responded, of about the 40 people who responded, 39 people, over half of them, gut reaction was alternative 3. We're not going to hold you to that. So if you change your mind later, that's okay. We are launching a bunch of surveys to get additional feedback from you all on the alternatives, and so you'll have another opportunity to look at these scenarios. And then you can see also that there's a mix of people who liked alternatives 1 and 2 as well. So about half of the participants liked those ones as well. Only 1 vote for the current general plan. And then, so we asked also how important it was to balance jobs and housing. So that was one of the metrics that we've been looking at internally as a team to really understand, like, if the city continues to grow jobs, does it grow housing in tandem and in concert with that? So as you can see, about 60% of the respondents to the survey said that it was very important or extremely important to balance jobs and housing, and that only about 20% said it was slightly or not important at all. So thanks for everyone for sharing their thoughts.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to run through a couple questions here, and then I'm going to share my screen so you can see there's a couple questions that were related directly to the maps. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing these results. Okay, let's see. Let's start with a question about, or a general comment about sustainability. Jennifer mentioned that one thing that is missing is a big idea. With a commitment to sustainability, to achieving zero emissions. The ideas of transportation and transforming the creek certainly help with that goal, but sustainability should be integrated into every facet of our community development moving forward. So thank you for that, Jennifer. I see a lot of nodding heads. I do think that's something that the city is also very much committed to. So thank you for that comment. And then here we go. I'm going to go ahead and take a shot here and share my screen and see if you guys can see this one question as we're starting to. Okay, so, oh, am I sharing the wrong screen? I might be sharing the wrong screen. Do you guys see the Giants right now? It's probably not what you want to see. Oh, unless you're a Giants fan like I am, then you would love to see them. Let's try this. Oh, no, I guess it doesn't want to share. Hold on one sec. Sorry, all. That's interesting.
I can see the whiteboard when you share it, Dave.
Did that come up for you last time?
Yeah.
We could see the whiteboard when you shared it.
Okay, cool. Fast. There you go. You can see it okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. I, for some reason, am seeing my desktop, so I didn't know why. So here is where we are tabulating all your results. I'm going to zoom out here real quick so you can get a sense. We're using these virtual whiteboards these days to be able to quickly kind of take down your input. We're going to be using this more succinctly during the sub-area meetings where we'll be doing topical conversations and could actually add stuff to maps. We might even at some point give you all the ability to be able to paste sticky notes onto these maps as well. So we're really excited about it, or at least I am. So I thought I'd share that with you. But we had a couple questions come up here related to land use that had to do with the purple circle that Catherine mentioned. What is the purple circle near Hickey Boulevard? What kind of mixed use transit facility are we thinking of? And that's related to this map here, if you all can see it on your screen. And I don't know if anyone from the team wanted to take a crack at that question. I know this is still very high level still.
Yeah, so what we're talking about there is that there's currently a series of kind of retail uses. There's a little shopping center right there and a gas station across the street. And I can't remember if it's the Chevron, so I apologize, right in that area. So we're talking about kind of creating a little neighborhood center there, which might have some retail, some housing would be allowed, you know, in kind of a low density format.
Great.
And that is where the grocery outlet is. I can confirm.
There you go. Question answered. Excellent. Thank you. Then moving over to some of the questions that came up about alternative 2. Eric had a question as to why is so much of the industrial area removed, and that is not allowing for dynamic economy, that is not focused on one job sector. So Hala, if you could remove your cursor, please. I'm gonna, thank you. There we go. Any thoughts?
It's a really good question, Eric, main buddy Eric. We in the alternatives try to test a number of different ideas. In some of those ideas where we maintained a bigger core area of industrial space, in some of those alternatives we maintain a much smaller area of that industrial space. So that's part of what the land use alternatives are trying to test from a policy perspective, kind of which of those kinds of directions feels right to folks in terms of the long-term growth of the city. Now, the context of it is that we know a lot of that, a lot of those uses have been transitioning over the past decade into other uses. And so we know that those kind of production, distribution, and repair uses are facing increasing challenges with higher rents that are being driven up by other types of uses within the city. So in particular, those tech and biotech and life sciences uses are kind of helping to drive up the prices and costs of rents for all of those other users within the city. And that's been kind of the trend and trajectory. So it's our ideas in these alternatives to really test these different kind of ideas about how much of that area we should kind of protect and maintain within the city. So each of those alternatives has a little bit of a different amount. And in some of those alternatives, you can see that we wouldn't just necessarily allow it to maintain and stay what it is now, but allow it to evolve over time to something new and different that might not be there now and might not be allowed now. So to allow multi-story warehousing and industrial, which we're starting to see now in these areas where there's much more pressure for land and development.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. We had a question from Catherine. For mixed use, are we talking about developing condos or apartments? Which condos? With condos, you get owners. With apartments, you get renters, and that can make a difference for this city. Good point. I think we had talked about a little about this before, but Eric, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you would be looking at, Catherine, I think you'd be looking at both. I mean, the reality is that as the city grows over time, you'd be looking at adding both renter-occupied housing and owner-occupied housing in those condo units. And often the difference is just market cycle. In some market cycles, they're very strong for condos and owner-occupied housing units, and others it's stronger for the rental-occupied housing units. So you see these changes over time. It's not usually one or the other, but they're kind of going up and down over time with each of them. Now, the city has a choice and can make choices about policy priorities, whether to prioritize owner-occupied housing in some cases and in some areas, or renter. So those are some of the kinds of things that we can be talking about over time as we develop the general plan and some of those more detailed kind of policy questions that might come up.
Great, thank you, Eric. You all could probably see this question on the screen as well, but Roderick had a question about did the zoning on some of the residential neighborhoods like North Westboro get messed up on the alternatives? He thought that SB 330 prevented down zoning.
SB 330 does in fact Roderick, is a good question and knowledgeable about state law. It's put a moratorium on downzoning residential areas overall across, I think it's a 5-year moratorium on downzoning to meet the current housing crisis across the state. We don't downzone anything, but one of the things that we tested on El Camino was reducing the heights, which isn't technically downzoning. So you'd still allow the same amount of residential units on those sites, but you would do it in buildings that were smaller in scale and lower in height. So that maybe be a little bit more compatible with the neighborhoods that are around the area. I don't think we intentionally downzone any areas within Westboro or any of the others. It might just be, Roderick, that some of the areas and the colors just got kind of squeezed together to simplify the maps. It's hard to get through all of this information, so we had to simplify a lot of the maps.
Thank you, Roderick and Eric. And one last question on alternative 2 was, in order to convert old school sites to residential, does the city need to get permission from the neighbors or voters? Tough question.
It does not. Those sites are, I believe, both owned by the South San Francisco Unified School District.
Right.
Those are independent. It's an independent local authority who has land use control over their sites. Now, I know if it were to be residential, they would work with the city to come up with a plan and the neighbors to come up with a plan that makes sense and is compatible with the neighbors around it.
Great, thanks, Eric. We haven't heard from Christy yet, so I'm going to jump to a question from Christy Camacho. The school sites are under South San Francisco USD jurisdiction, not city. Are you including the school sites in your total housing units for alts 2 and 3? Yeah,
we are. They're a relatively small number of units, but they're significant. There are, I think, a couple hundred units all totaled in both of those sites.
Great. And then Eric had a follow-up about what about the health risks, as New York, LA, and Houston are examples of more housing equals more public health risk if it's high density.
So I'm guessing that this is in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not sure what the context for this question is, but right. A lot of the early discussion around the pandemic was that the areas that were the densest in the country were being hit by the COVID-19 pandemic the most. But it's not just density. I think we need to think about the overlays with a lot of other stressors that are affecting those communities. So income levels, chronic health conditions, all of those things factor into where the biggest magnitudes of outbreaks were with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know after a couple of months, the city of New York did some analysis and showed that some of the densest neighborhoods on, say, the Upper East Side that were super wealthy and were some of the densest neighborhoods had some of the lowest COVID-19 case incidence rates, and that they were really concentrated in neighborhoods that were lower income, were communities of color, particularly Latino and Hispanic neighborhoods, and those with people with chronic health conditions. So it's not just density, it's a layer of disadvantage that I think you would want to be thinking about as well.
Thanks, Eric. It's a great point. Related to that, Jay had a concern about traffic and lack of parking due to increased densities, and if that's something that we're planning for.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so as we start to talk about the implementation of these land use plans in any of the scenarios, we'll be talking about things like transportation demand management. So how we supply and accommodate parking in different projects, how we do things like support and promote public transportation use, and then how we get people to walk and bike more. All of those types of policies and then implementation measures through the zoning code can reduce those trips and the travel for individual households within those new developments.
Great, thanks, Eric. I think Catherine had a very similar concern as Jay there. And then Christy had a follow-up comment about if the committee, and by committee, for those that don't know, there is an advisory committee as part of this process that we meet with regularly. And she's curious if the committee will be able to develop variations of these alternatives. That sounds fun.
We're going to give Christy a marker. Yes. So I mean, the purpose of the alternatives is really to test these different ideas, and we really have the opportunity to kind of not mix and match per se, but really to kind of think about how the different sub areas relate to one another, and think about like, oh, we really like this idea that's happening in Lyndonville. Let's keep that idea in this alternative. Maybe it's an alternative 3, but we really like what's happening in alternative 2 east of 101. So we can start to, you know, piece these things together into a preferred alternative, and then make adjustments around the edges, and make adjustments to them as we see fit. And so we'll be looking at the citywide scale that we're talking about tonight, but at the sub area scale, which I'm going to show you in a minute, like we're going to be talking at a much finer grain of scale, and you can really see those differences between the alternatives, and then you'll be able to have those conversations about what makes sense in terms of changes and kind of piecing them together.
Great, thanks. Christy, I see that you have your hand raised. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you would like to add any additional context to that. I don't know, you should be able to, there you go.
Sorry, I don't have my hand raised.
Oh, okay. You have a little blue hand next to your name. That's kind of
I don't
wild.
know.
All right, we'll go ahead and
I'm
lower
not
it.
even in Zoom, so I don't know. I mean, I'm in it, but I'm not on that screen.
No problem. No problem. Okay. Well, you did have another follow-up question here that for the neighborhood-specific polls, you'd be interested if we can separate out the committee versus staff poll responses and the general public's response. And I do think we could look through that and try our best. I do think that the polls that we did here today would be difficult to do, but as we get to the surveys and that process, we could look into that. It looked like Eric was interested in those results as well. Let's see, for infrastructure, both underground and above ground needs to be flexible enough to allow for additional residents and greater demand for water, gas, electricity. Will the plan include growth in public service demand, such as additional fire station to meet the needs of the greater number of residents and daytime commuters? And I think we answered some of that before, but Eric, do you want to add any context to that?
Yeah, so the answer, Eric, it's a great question. The answer is yes. And so the general plan itself will have policies to support the implementation of service changes with increased demand and growth. That's actually one of the things that by statutory law, general plans do. But the environmental impact report that will be done as part of the process will really account for that and look at those changes in service levels, and so that those can be part of the plan and plan update process as well.
Great, thank you, Eric. And a follow-up question was, how can we get Lyndonville back to being a possibility for housing, especially since there is housing right across the street in San Bruno?
So I think each of the alternatives shows some amount of housing growth within the, it's shown in purple as residential mixed use within the Lyndonville area. And each of those alternatives shows a little bit of a different pattern of that. So from a small amount in alternative 1 to a moderate amount in alternative 2 to a lot in alternative 3.
Great, thank you. And I think there was general comment, the school district is in phase 4 of planning for workforce housing on the Fox Ridge property. Which sounds very exciting to me. I don't know if there's any additional thoughts on that. Let's see, zooming out here. Team, can you highlight any other questions, comments that we've missed by hovering over with your mouse, Diana or Suhaila? I think we've covered the bulk of them that have come up here recently. We're trying to kind of get the responses on here as well, so we can come up with a succinct summary. After the meeting, I think we've covered the main questions that we received earlier. So unless there's any other comments, I don't see any popping up. Eddie did respond to Pat's comment saying in regards to the Fox Ridge site and adding in the school sites for housing increase numbers, it doesn't seem like a good idea to include this site. I would request that it be taken off. Thank you, Eddie. Duly noted.
Dave, can you hold on a second?
Sure.
Andre,
Will do soon.
we can only hear your interpretation now. I don't know if you can hear me, but we can only hear your interpretation now.
I could only hear you, Eric. Is that something that's happening on?
It's fixed now.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Fun with technology. Fun with technology. It's tricky when we have 3 different interpreters on here trying to do this concurrently, but
Yeah.
thank you all for your patience. Looks like Catherine actually did have her hand raised. Catherine, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to add an additional question or comment.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that there's an interpreter on the line, but it's been fixed, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and give controls back over to you, Eric, if you want to take us on to the next phase of the presentation.
Got it. The wrap up.
The wrap
We're
up.
getting near the end. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, we're doing a series, these 4 sub-area meetings, which are happening over the next 2 weeks. And during those meetings, we're not going to necessarily do large group presentation and then only Q&A. We're actually going to really kind of facilitate a conversation in small groups and kind of talk through each of the different sub-areas and the differences within those sub-areas. So like tonight, I'll give you a shorter background presentation, really focused on what's happening within each of those 4 sub-areas. So those are downtown, Lindenville, east of 101, and the El Camino corridor. And then we'll kind of really get into, after that presentation, we're really going to get into the details and conversation at this scale of the alternatives, right? So you can really see the difference across each of the areas. And this is downtown up in the area, and you can really kind of zoom in and see the details of each of these areas. And so it's a little hard to do that at the city scale, so we're going to do that in these sub-area meetings, in these kind of breakout group discussions, so you'll be able to see them. And this is an example of what that kind of looks like in east of 101, when you kind of take each of those 3 alternatives and sit them next to each other side by side, so you can really see the differences in, say, the mixed-use transit-oriented community by the Caltrain station, how it changes over each of the alternatives, how the intensification of land use in, whether it's life sciences or industrial, happens in the alternatives. So the goal of these planning sub-area meetings will be to get into this further level of detail and get into these more detailed and weedy conversations about the land use alternatives. We'll also be doing that for the Lindenville area, and I think this gets at one of the comments that Eric had. So, you know, thinking about how much housing is provided here, how much office is provided here, how much industrial space, and what the kind of the balance of that is across the district. So you can kind of see it at this sort of scale where you can look across them and see these different alternatives. And then finally, we'll do the same also for the El Camino corridor, where we'll be thinking about that same pattern of those 3 centers in that mixed use corridor and those differences that you can see across each of those alternatives, and kind of talk about those. And then the adjacent sites, which are not along the El Camino corridor, but ones that came up in the Q&A on the school sites, and then the Westboro Shopping Center and Hickey Shopping Center areas. So we'll kind of get in this next set of public meetings into that more detail. And then, so that's kind of really where we're going to get to the next step. And so what we want to do is hear from you, your colleagues, your friends, your peers. We have launched this web page at shapessf.net /alternatives. On that page, you're going to find things about upcoming meetings. There's some primer videos that we set and we did in advance about what is land use and what are alternatives. So people who maybe don't know will be able to go there and learn about those things. We have all the alternative maps and their descriptions. We also have all of the presentations already up for each of the sub-area meetings that are coming up. The Spanish translations for those are up already. And there will be Tagalog and Mandarin versions of those coming to the website as well. They're almost done and will be put up as well. And then we have links to surveys. So this is where people can provide us comment and feedback on the alternatives. So tonight, I ask that you go to the website and fill out the survey you may fill out. There are surveys for the whole city, kind of overall, and there are surveys for each of the planning sub-areas. So downtown, El Camino, Lindenville, and east of 101. Again, those surveys are in both Spanish and in English. Those surveys look like this. They're going to ask you about your preferred land use alternative for each of these areas. And it's also going to ask you about how we can implement those preferred alternatives for each of these areas. So what are the housing strategies, economy strategies, transportation, land use, parks and open space. So we encourage you to go there and fill in these surveys, because this is really where you're going to be able to provide us input on these different kind of land use alternatives for the city. So as I mentioned, there's a series of upcoming meetings. We have a planning commission study session on Thursday evening at 7 p.m. where we'll be talking about the land use alternatives, very similar to what we did this evening, a little slimmed down presentation. And then starting on July 20th, we're going to have an east of 101 sub-area meeting. That will be at 1 p.m., 1 to 3 p.m. during the day. And then a downtown sub-area meeting on the 20th from 6 to 8 p.m. The Lindenville sub-area meeting will be on July 28th at 1 p.m. and the El Camino sub-area meeting will be that evening at 6 p.m. We're going to then take all the information we gather from these group discussions, these questions, these chats, and all the surveys, and we're going to present that out to a joint session of Planning Commission and City Council on August the 19th. So we can get their comment and feedback on the land use alternatives. So there are lots of different ways for you to get engaged and involved in this process of developing them, whether you just whether you just do a survey, whether you attend these upcoming sub-area meetings and participate in the breakout rooms and discussion, or whether you attend the Planning Commission and City Council meeting to provide your comments. So there's lots of opportunities and ways to kind of provide your thoughts and comments on these alternatives. And this kind of just shows that schedule over the next several months of the timeline for the development of the land use map for the general plan. So we'll be doing this series of virtual meetings in July that I just mentioned. We'll have this joint session with Council and Planning Commission in August. We'll probably come back in September with a community workshop on the preferred alternative, and then meetings with Planning Commission and City Council in October and November on kind of that preferred alternative of that general plan land use map that we were discussing earlier. I want to just recommend and suggest that everybody go to shapessf.net. There's a ton of really great information on the general plan update process, on the background work that we've done, all the community engagement that's been done to date. If you have questions, please contact Lisa Costa-Sanders. She is the general plan program administrator for the update process. Our contact information is here. You'll find it on the website as well. And with that, we're gonna launch a final poll, and we want to hear a little bit more from you all about how you heard about the meeting tonight and got engaged in the process, and whether you have participated in previous general plan update meetings. So with that, I think we can launch the last poll, Dave.
Yeah, so this first question is, did you participate in previous workshop or sub-area meeting? Just want to get a sense of the knowledge. Sounds like there was a lot of great knowledge brought to this meeting with all the great questions that were asked. So we really appreciate all of your time. Leave it open for a little bit longer here. Excellent. I just want to comment too that we had, outside of city staff and the consultant team, probably a good 65 or so members of the community that joined us here tonight, which is excellent. Thank you again for joining us. So sharing the results here real quick, looks like a good majority of folks have been coming along with us, either at the community workshops or sub-area meetings or other pop-up events that we've had, maybe not as many. But thank you again for being with us throughout this process. And we had one final comment, just to make sure that folks are receiving the notices that are going out and how they're being received. We just want to ask a quick question about how you heard about the event, which I'm launching right now. We've heard that the mailers are very effective. We hope that's the case. The city had sent a mailer, basically a postcard out to every single mailbox. So we're hoping that many of you received that as well. Looks like a lot of folks also received the email, and that was the catch, which is great. Let's see, I'm gonna leave it open for a couple more minutes, couple seconds, I mean. Okay, it looks like emails are still very effective, as most of you all received an email, and that's what's got you here. So that's great. That's great. Excellent. I don't think we have any other questions for you, but we do have time if there were any other questions you had for us, anything that you heard. Eric just mentioned we would love to see you at upcoming sub-area meetings. We're really going to dive in deeper and more kind of small group discussions so that we can allow a platform for each of you to be able to discuss this in detail and then bring that information back to the larger group. So that's another great opportunity coming up. But I see that folks just from the chat room very excited about this process. Thank you for that. And you asked, oh, there's a question, thank you, Kelly, of where the notes and recording will be posted. That will be posted on the project website. The great thing about Zoom is that everything just gets recorded instantaneously. It's going up to the city's cloud, and we'll have it shortly. I would say within the next day or so, we'll have that up on the project website. And we'll also be summarizing all the great notes that we've taken from all the comments and questions that we received. And we'll hope to get that on the project website as well within the next week or two. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And we're hoping to really kind of take these notes and the notes we get from all the sub-area meetings and really kind of creating a nice summary of this whole phase in the project, because it is very important to get your feedback as we continue to move forward here. So thank you for that question. And Diana just posted to the chat window as well the website again, and where all this great information is currently being housed directly. So please keep an eye out for that as well. Okay, I don't see any other comments or questions. Eric or city staff, any other words of wisdom before we wrap up here?
Not a word of wisdom, but just a note of appreciation. We do really appreciate all of you participating tonight and coming out to hear about the land use alternatives. It's a lot of material to cover, we realize, and it's hard to get through, and so we wanted to kind of provide enough context and understanding that folks can really dig into this and think about this over the next month or so, and provide lots of opportunities. So we really hope to see you at future events, whether they're the sub-area meetings or participating at Planning Commission and City Council as public comment. And please, please, please go onto the website and take the surveys. That's really the primary way that we'll get feedback on the alternatives and those key strategies. So please do that. So again, thanks everyone, and we look forward to seeing you over the next week or so.
Thanks so much, all. Have a great evening.